Welcome back to Inside the Vatican with America Media. I'm your host, Colleen and Gerry, and as always, I am joined by our veteran Vatican correspondent, Gerard O'Connell. Good morning from New Orleans, Gerry.
Good afternoon from Rome, Colleen. We've nice spring day here, I think.
Sounds lovely. The sun looks nice on your face for our video viewers. And Gerry, I'm very excited to see you soon in New York at Fordham University for your book launch. Registration for our listeners is still open for that. So if you're going to be in the New York area March 25th, please register. We've got the link in the show notes, and please do it quickly because we are going to run out of space possibly. All right, Gerry, for today's show, we're going to talk first about cardinals in the U.S. speaking out against the Iran war. We'll also talk about a new nuncio for the United States. And then in the second part, after the break, we'll talk about the Synod study group reports that have just come out on women, seminaries, and digital mission. So to get us started, Gerry, as we talked about last week, Pope Leo has been relatively restrained in his comments on the Iran war, and we talk about some of the possible reasons for that on the show last week. This week, we're going to talk primarily about what we've been hearing from cardinals, particularly in the US. But first, I wanted to ask you, have there been any updates? What has Leo said since last week's show?
Well, last Sunday he came out and he called explicitly for a halt, what he called, to the thunderous sound of the bombings. In other words, he called for a stop to the fighting and the beginning of negotiations. It was a very clear message last Sunday. And of course, he prays for the people who have been killed. Right now, we know that about 1,255 Iranians had been killed, according to the Ministry of Health in Iran yesterday. 140 American service people have been injured, and 8 have been killed, according to the Pentagon, I think you call it now, the Ministry of War. And then 13 people have been killed in Israel, and then smaller number have been killed in the Gulf states and other countries.
And Gerry, we also had some comments from Pope Leo this morning. We're recording this on Wednesday, March 11th, at the general audience, right?
Yes, he spoke this morning, and he also expressed sorrow last Monday at the killing by the Israelis of a Lebanese Maronite priest in southern Lebanon, in a village in southern Lebanon. That area, the southern Lebanon, has for years been an area of conflict, basically, because the Israelis accused the Hezbollah, which is the armed group in Lebanon, which is supported by Iran and which supports Iran, of attacking Israel. More recently, when the war started in Iran, they sent some missiles to Israel, and Israel came back with force. And with a tank, they shot near the house where this priest was, and the priest went with other parishioners to help some of the wounded people from an earlier round of shooting. And then he got killed in this. And so the Pope, he's called Father Pierre El Rai. And the Pope this morning said his name means, El Rai means shepherd. And he said he was truly a good shepherd like Christ. He did not abandon his flock. But Israel has ordered all the people in the southern part of Lebanon to leave the villages. And many, many of them are Christian. But the priests and some other priests and religious have stayed with their people. They don't want to leave, because if they leave, they lose their houses and they're left with nothing. And so the Pope praised him this morning and said this morning his funeral is taking place in the village. And then he went on to pray for all those who have been killed in this conflict, including children. He's talking about I think we reckon now about 200 children, because 150 were killed on the first day of the war in Tehran,
In the attack on the girls' school.
in a primary school, all girls primary school. And it's alleged, and there seems to be increasing evidence, that it was the result of missile from the United States military. Now, the Pope also spoke about the need for people everywhere to pray for peace. He constantly returns to this.
And very related to how the Pope is, following this crisis, I saw reports recently also that the cardinal from Tehran, Cardinal Dominic Mathieu, has been evacuated to Rome and that he actually met with the Pope. So presumably discussing the situation there.
Yes, he met with the Pope this morning after the general audience. The cathedral and the seat of the Archbishop, the Cardinal, is in the grounds of the Italian embassy. So it's not outside, it's in the grounds of the Italian embassy. The Italian government decided to evacuate all the staff, so about 50, from the embassy, and they moved to Baku. And in that evacuation, it seems that the Cardinal and also the chargé d'affaires of the Holy See Embassy, the nunciature, was evacuated.
Gerry, in view of Pope Leo's recent comments over the last week, would you still characterize his comments on this war as being restrained?
Well, he's been very clear, I think, and not restrained in saying, this fighting has to stop now. He's made very clear on this, and he's also, in all his statements, he's called for stop to the fighting and opening the space for negotiation. And I think the problem is his call is falling on deaf ears, that there seems to be no interest in the United States, in Israel, in the present moment, in stopping the attack.
And in fact, Gerry, we've seen the glorification of it from some of our leaders here in the US over the last week. The White House posted a number of videos on social media splicing together footage of the war, of real human destruction, with pieces of action movies, frames from action movies. And they said, "Justice the American way." And this sparked Cardinal Cupich of Chicago to put out a statement on March 7th, in which he denounced the gamification of war, of turning war into entertainment. So let's talk about that statement.
Well, I think, first of all, the Pope was probably very happy with what the Cardinal has said. The Cardinal met the Pope quite recently.
And one of the reasons that you posed last week for why Leo may have been relatively restrained was that he might be waiting for the bishops of the countries involved to speak out, or that he wants to encourage them to speak out.
Absolutely. He has made very clear from the beginning that he expects that the Pope doesn't have to do everything. He expects the bishops in a given country to address the situation in their own country and what they see as not in conformity with the Christian gospel. And so I think Cardinal Cupich is exactly on track here, because to dehumanize what is happening and make it look like a game is really, we've reached a very low level in our understanding of what's happening. He called it a real war with real death and real suffering being treated like it's a video game. It's sickening. That was his statement. And he made clear that, we are moving away from reality, putting it as fiction, what is deeply destructive. I mean, and then he speaks about, I think, the mother and children being killed. He speaks about people old and young. And the Minister of Health, in fact, in Iran yesterday said from 8 months to 88 years old, you have the victims. And so Cardinal Cupich was saying, let's wake up our conscience. Our conscience is basically, he's been saying, the conscience has been anesthetized by this kind of approach to war. War is not a pleasant thing. It is not a game. It is a highly destructive thing of men's and women's humanity.
And yet, even in not just the way the war is presented to the public in the US through media, but also in the actual practice of war, there is this trend towards gamification. I remember a report from the Ukraine war where they were talking about how, soldiers had a point system that was awarded to them for hitting certain targets with drones. You got 12 points for hitting a human, you got 40 for hitting a tank. This is a real practice of war that they were gamifying in order to kind of keep soldiers' morale up, to keep them involved, to keep them killing. It's horrifying.
Yeah, and it is really a call to conscience, as Cardinal Cupich said. It's a wake-up call and say, how far down the line do we go to lose our humanity, our sense of compassion, our sense that it is not good to kill people?
And Jerry, here in the US, it really does become a form of entertainment, even a form of profit, not just for the arms dealers, but we saw a big settlement here in the US recently where a gambling app had to settle after they allowed users to bet on Khamenei being killed. And people predicted that and made money from it. So literally turning this into a game.
Well, everything becomes commercialized, and the markets, they calculate on, you know, if this happens in the war, then this, and they made money is made. The arms merchants are reaping high profits.
And Jerry, that relates to something that Cardinal David from the Philippines said in an interview with Vatican News recently. He was asked, who benefits from wars and who does not benefit. And he talked about the workers who are caught in the conflict. Obviously, the Philippines exports so many workers around the world. Anywhere you go, a big part of the Catholic immigrant community will be Filipino workers. But he talked about also the gamification of this. And he said, from distant command centers, military operators stare at screens where maps, radar signals, and algorithm generated targets move like icons in a computer game. A cursor moves, a coordinate is selected, a click is made, and a missile is launched. And it now appears that that attack on the girls' school was also decided in part by artificial intelligence.
Yes, and this is really opening up another chapter, uh, Colleen, which I imagine will be addressed when the Pope eventually comes with his encyclical. The
It's already
way,
been addressed in the previous Vatican documents on AI.
yeah, we've seen it used, massive destruction in Gaza. We've seen it being used now, and they're using robots in Ukraine, Russia. We have reached a level where the advances in technology are being used massively for destruction, for the identification of people to be destroyed.
And Jerry, we have this whole system in Catholic thought of the idea of a just war. And recently, Cardinal McElroy, the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., gave an interview to the diocesan paper, The Catholic Standard. It's actually coming out in print tomorrow on March 12th. But he talked about kind of why this war does not meet the requirements of a just war. And I think it's helpful to contextualize this the way that McElroy does, which is that he notes that John Paul II and Pope Francis were completely opposed to war. Uh, but he says, in some emergency situations, this idea of a just war kind of o- outlines when it's acceptable to take military action. So essentially, you have to meet 6 conditions all at the same time. And McElroy in this interview went through those conditions and talked about the ones that are not met. So maybe we can talk through that.
Yes, I think two things here. First of all, Cardinal McElroy is really probably one of the top experts in the field in terms of the Church's social teaching
And also in terms of political science.
and political science. He has a credibility and a knowledge and an intelligence that enables people to understand, well, what is at stake here. He said, the first thing is the war, there must be a just cause. And he says the war must be undertaken in defense against an attack that is grave and certain on a nation, its allies, or a defenseless human community. Preventative war is not this.
And this has been called a preventative war, right? This is not a response to an attack.
Yeah, and when you listen to the statements by Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, they said Israel was going to attack. We knew this. They were going to go in with or without us. So we decided we had to go in because if they attacked our bases, our troops, our personnel would be attacked by Iran. So this is extraordinary. There was no imminent, nobody can say there was an imminent danger to the United States. There's no evidence for that.
Right, and then the second requirement that he raises is that the legitimate authority in the country contemplating war must declare war. The US has done that. And then the third requirement is that the country goes to war with right intention, namely to redress the specific just cause and restore peace. And here's where he really kind of tears into the US's motives.
Yes, he says our goals and intentions are absolutely unclear. I think so many people will agree with that. Ranging from, and the goals that have been presented, the destruction of Iran's conventional and nuclear weapons potential, to the overthrow of the regime, to the establishment of a democratic government, to unconditional surrender. These are various goals that
Right,
have
it's
been
a whole
put
mix
forward.
of motivations.
Yeah. So the right intention, what is the right intention here? This is his question. And the fourth requirement mentioned by Cardinal McElroy is that war is meant to be the last resort to repel the aggression.
Right. He doesn't specifically address whether he thinks that the US is not meeting this, but certainly you can read the situation and decide whether you think it's the last resort.
Well, what we know, Colleen, is that there were negotiations underway. In good faith and bad faith, we don't know, but the negotiations were underway, and another meeting for the negotiating team was to be held on the Monday, but the war started on the Saturday.
hmm The fifth point is the other big one that he outlines as not being met. And this one is that the expected destruction from the war must not outweigh the expected good. And here he says it's far from clear that the benefits of this war will outweigh the harm which will be done. And then he adds Iran's morally despicable decision to target its neighbors in the region has spread the expanse of destruction. Lebanon may fall into civil war. The world's oil supply is under great strain. The potential disintegration of Iran could well produce new and dangerous realities, and the possibility of immense casualties on all sides is immense. So he doesn't see that harm outweighing the expected good.
Yes, and many other people think this could start a civil war within the country, and you could end up with a failed state, and an important failed state, given the control of oil it has. So, but that point made by Cardinal McElroy reminded me of the argument used by the Vatican and Pope John Paul II on the eve of the war on Iraq in 2003, saying, what's the good that's going to come from this war? And they said the suffering of the people, the deaths. And I think what Cardinal McElroy is saying now is, in a way, along that same track, and the background, this thing has not been thought through carefully. What are the consequences? What are the benefits? The likely benefits. You can't be certain in life, but the likely benefits. And all we hear is that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Now there are 9 countries have nuclear weapons, including Israel and the United States. And so you have Cardinal McElroy, and he said there's a reasonable hope of success.
Right, that's the 6th pillar,
It's the
yeah.
6th pillar. There's a reasonable hope of success in what you're doing.
Mhm.
Now, what is the measure of success here? This is a big question. And when you listen to President Trump, the Secretary for War, Secretary of State, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then the Iranians, well, what is the measure of success?
Mhm.
And we're left with more questions than answers.
Gerry, one last thing that I wanted to mention as we're talking about this is that, you know, obviously the US bishops have a certain role to play in speaking the Catholic teaching to our government officials, to the American public, but we also have a new nuncio to the United States who's been appointed just this week. And that nuncio's job will also be to communicate on behalf of the Holy See with the Trump administration or with whatever administration follows. Um, and Pope Leo assigned Archbishop Gabriele Caccia, who has lived in New York for years. He has represented the Holy See at the United Nations in New York. So he's a longtime diplomat who knows the US really well. But I wanted to ask you, do you have any insights about this appointment or what it could mean?
I think it's a very interesting appointment at 2 levels. A nuncio, in other words, the Pope's envoy, the ambassador of the Holy See to a country, and the representative to the church in the country. That's his 2 roles. He comes with particular experience. He has been in Lebanon as nuncio, as a Vatican ambassador, during the war in 2010. He has been in the Philippines when Duterte, who is now in prison in The Hague, was president and was killing people on his war against drugs. And so he's coming with, let's say, hands-on experience of war and of this criminal activity of just taking out people. He's also been at the United Nations, and he's sat through the discussions on the war in Ukraine first, on the war in Gaza. So he's a man with great experience. I know him. I've met him, and he's a listener. He communicates very well. He's quite sharp on understanding the situation. He's a man who is, I think, appropriate for this moment in the history of the United States Church and the country. So he will represent the Pope, I think, very well, and I think it's been a very fine choice.
And Gerry, maybe in the future we can circle back to the role that he'll have in recommending bishops to be appointed in the US.
This is a key role in terms of the church.
For now, we'll leave this story here. Our listeners can read all the stories that we discussed at the links in our show notes. We're going to take a break, and when we return, we'll talk about those Synod study group reports. Stay with us. Welcome back. The final reports from the Synod's now 15 study groups are beginning to be published. Last week, we got the reports from Study Group 3 on mission in the digital environment and Study Group 4 on the revision of the documents that govern seminaries. And this week, the report from Study Group 5 on women's ministries was published. Now, we did have a good idea going into this what was going to come out in each of these because we got their interim reports back in November. So, we're going to briefly cover in this part of the show what was in each of these three reports that have been published. And Jerry, let's start with Group 3 on the digital mission that we got last week. Their big recommendation was the creation of a new pontifical commission. Can you tell me about that?
Well, yes, Pontifical Commission for Digital Culture and the New Technologies. Obviously, it's one of the creative areas in trying to bring the gospel to people and to help them to understand the church. So you have got all these influencers, as it were, and some of them met the Pope recently. It's in a way it's a new area. It's a new territory, and it's important that the church is there because that it's reaching also a younger generation. This is where they see the big advantage of it. It's going to reach the younger generation because the church has been losing young people.
And I think the big question here is formation, right? Formation not only for like church leaders who are trying to figure out how to navigate this new world that kind of falls outside of traditional diocesan boundaries, the report mentions, but also giving guidelines for priests, religious lay people, regular Catholics in the pews on how to approach this space as a space of evangelization, and also for bishops' conferences and dioceses, how to integrate digital missionaries into their plans for their dioceses or countries.
This is a whole very important area, and I think we're at the beginning of this. But that it's come. Remember, Colleen, all these reports are an indication that the implementation of the Synod, which finished in October 2025, and you were here in Rome with our other colleagues, that it's now beginning to be implemented. And these reports are meant to facilitate the implementation and to open up discussions at the local level and to propel interest and activity in the implementation field.
And in a general way, we should say, the issuing of these final reports, actually, the turning in of these final reports marked the conclusion of these groups' work. So now their recommendations go to the Pope. So it's up to Pope Leo whether he wants to create this pontifical commission. So we're kind of at a wait and see moment on the things that we're going to hear about in these reports.
Absolutely. And one thing we should say to our listeners is they can read these reports by going into the Synod website, and you have the full text in different languages. And I think we can give the link to that in our show notes.
Yeah, certainly. These first two that we're talking about, digital mission and the seminaries, are very digestible. They're like 25 pages long. The last one that we'll spend some time on women is much longer, 74 pages. But let's move on to the one about seminaries from Study Group 4. So, as we expected from the interim report, this group decided to produce a document that will accompany the Ratio Fundamentalis. This is the document that governs seminary formation, which we talked about at length in our seminaries deep dives that I'll link to in the show notes. They decided that rather than doing a full revision of that document, which only recently started being implemented, they decided to produce a document that would accompany it. So they're meant to be read together. And in this document, they called for a lot of the things that people told us they wanted to see out of seminary formation in the Synod in that deep dive that we did.
Well, I think this is a very interesting document because the seminary system we have, 400 years, goes back to Trent, more than 400. And I've spoken to many bishops, priests, students. Everybody recognizes that it needs radical renewal. And remember that during the Synod, during the last session of the Synod, Pope Francis intervened, emphasizing strongly the need for formation proper formation.
Especially of priests. I remember he got up at one of them and gave a very strong intervention. Maybe this is one that you're talking about against clericalism.
Yes, but he underlined formation, formation, formation. And so now this document comes up and says priestly formation to be immersed in the life of the Christian community. In other words, you're not separated in a bubble outside the Christian community. And also the possibility of alternating the seminary residence with periods living in parish communities.
That's a big change, and then also this call for women to be more involved in seminary formation. And in both of these cases, they gave a list of 26 best practices that are being carried out throughout the world, and one of those examples was of in France, there's a seminary where a married couple is resident in the seminary so that they can kind of share community life a little bit more with people in a different vocation than themselves.
Yes, and having women in the seminaries, I've said on this program before, I remember that Cardinal Lorenzi, who's not seen in the press, progressive wing of it, in the early 1970s in Onitsha, in Nigeria, he put married women on the board of seminaries, 1970, 71, on the board of seminaries. They can spot the problems much quicker than the priests, the married women.
Well, and Pope Leo himself studied alongside women in the seminary at Catholic Theological Union.
Absolutely. And he is continuing Pope Francis's push for giving women roles, not only as theologians, but also as formators.
Mhm. Mhm, and sometimes also as classmates, right? That was also a thing that, was mentioned in the final, report of the synod was that women should be alongside men in classrooms too. Alright, let's move quickly on to study group 5. This is the famous study group 5, I sometimes say, because we've covered it so much. This was the one that, had originally been tasked with, this question of the female diaconate. That question was then delegated to a separate commission that was revived. We got the final report from that commission back in December, and so we reported on that already, that they said no to the female diaconate, but not definitively, so that question is back to the Pope. But let's talk about what did come out in this document. So this study group was basically part of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, and they decided to produce a pretty long document on women's ministries in the church. And it had a lot of different kind of aspects to it. There are multiple appendices about women in scripture, women in church history, the question of authority versus power, and then also the experiences of women working in the Roman Curia, which I thought was interesting. So, Jerry, what stood out to you from this report?
Well, really, I think it's gone beyond the individual issue of women deacons to what you just said, the broader involvement of women in church life. And it says very clearly in the document, it says, and it recognizes, because it was what the Synod said, that the majority of people going to church are women. The majority of people collaborating in the local parishes are women. And so it says, have we given them the space, the recognition, or even using the language? It touches on the language that's used in terms of women. And it says, so it opens the horizon for women exercising different roles, including in decision making and decision taking, and including positions of government and the separation of orders from governance.
Yeah, this is kind of a thing that the document spends a decent amount of time talking about is this change that Pope Francis made in the Roman Curia to separate, priesthood, the power that comes with priesthood, from the power to run a Curia dicastery, for example. And then he appointed women to those spots. And this document makes clear that that model is meant to be taken up in dioceses around the world now. But I was struck that this call for new spaces, new forms of exercising authority for women, was also something that the Patrochi Commission, that commission on women deacons, landed on almost unanimously too, as something that they want to see. So I think the big question for us now is, what those new ministries, new spaces could look like, what Pope Leo will decide to implement from that.
Well, one thing is very clear to me is that Pope Leo is committed to advancing women in the church. I think that stands out already from what he said, but also I've heard from people who've talked with him. And there is no doubt about this,
It
that
stands out in his pastoral experience too.
it's what he experienced, as you say, in Chiclayo. And as bishop of a diocese, it was what he was advancing. And so as Pope, he's going to continue this. We've seen that in the appointment to the board, I call it that, of the appointment of bishops,
Right, the dicastery for bishops.
the
Yeah.
dicastery for bishops, he has appointed 3 women onto that. Also, when he met during for the Jubilee meeting of the representatives from the synodal experience in the different countries, he made very clear that he's going to go down that track. And so that is good news. And I think that it's important not to have the question of the women's deacon cloud this enormous area that's going to, I think, develop in the years ahead.
At the same time, the women deacons issue was something that was discussed at some length in the Synod Hall, and so we do continue to cover that story as well. So you can find at americamagazine.org my analysis piece on this Study Group 5 final report, and also a new translation that we're publishing of the Petrocchi Commission report, which has never officially been released in English, so that'll come with an explanatory document too. I'll link to all those in the show notes. And one final headline before we go, Chaldean Catholic Patriarch Cardinal Sako's resignation was accepted on March 10th, on Tuesday, 2 years after he submitted it. Now, usually with this much lead time, a successor would have already been named, but none was. So, Gerry, I wanted to ask you, this is a really difficult time to leave Chaldean Catholics in Iraq without a bishop. Why do you think this happened now?
Well, many questions have been raised. I know him. I've met him several times. He's had a very difficult period as the Chaldean Patriarch. And he said that he handed in his resignation when he reached 75 to Pope Francis, but Pope Francis stayed on. Now he has done 2 more years, and he must have talked with Leo as well and said, look, really, I want out. He's a man who talks a lot. And so I suspect that he will say more later.
Got it. All right, Gerry, thank you so much for your insights on that and also on all of our stories this week. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon in New York. Thanks.
Thank you. And looking forward to that too. And hoping Elizabeth is with me.
Absolutely.
She moves to Beirut tomorrow, flights permitting.
All right. We'll pray that she gets back to Rome safely and then over to the U.S. to join us. Inside the Vatican is a production of America Media. This week's episode was produced by Kevin Christopher Robles. Production assistance from Will Galtieri. To keep up with the latest out of the Vatican, please subscribe to America Magazine at americamagazine.org/subscribe. For America Media with Gerard O'Connell, I'm Colleen Dulle. We'll see you next time.